It's September 8th, 1973. The 1973 Southeast Asian Peninsular Games conclude in Singapore. Arnold Schwarzenegger wins the Mr. Olympia contest. And on television, the animated version of a live-action sci-fi series begins. Welcome to That 70s Review. Hello, fellow time travelers, and welcome to That 70s Review, where we look at the shows we loved as kids and which you're coming to love as adults to see if they hold up. And this time we're looking at the best piece of Star Trek produced in the 1970s. No, I said the best piece, and honestly, am I doing this joke again? Seriously, I need help.
Captain's log, stardate 54-4. Bones, can't you keep that thing quiet?
Sorry, Jim. Doesn't like the cage.
Okay, that's a little bit better, but it's still not quite there. Ah, there we go.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before.
Today we're looking at Star Trek, the animated series. I actually did watch this show as a kid, probably in reruns because I would have been only like 3 when it originally aired, but my memories of it are pretty hazy. One of the characters in this show did pop up in my Power Records book and record sets, though. I finally did watch it all the way through as an adult, and I have to say, it's got a lot going for it, despite ostensibly being a kid's show, which it really isn't. At least not exclusively. It's even the only Star Trek series to date to win an Emmy for Best Series, even if that Emmy was for Best Children's Series. And yet some people still think this show isn't canonical, including creator Gene Roddenberry himself, depending on the day and the time and the interview, that is. Maybe it's just because it's an animated series, which of course could never be canonical.
Why are you doing this to me? I need you to tell me that your senior officers are infallible heroes.
Well, they're not. And that's okay. We all joined Starfleet to dive headfirst into the unknown. We're explorers. Of course we don't always know what's going on. Did Picard know about the Borg? Did Kirk know about that giant Spock on Phylos? Did Dr. Crusher know about that ghost in the lamp thing from the Scottish planet that she hooked up with that one time?
Anyway, let's give you some background on this show and talk about why it really should be canon and whether you should take the time to watch it. In 1965, Gene Roddenberry... Actually, you know what? If you're watching this video, you likely already know how Star Trek came to be, and if you don't, there are plenty of much better and much more in-depth videos out there about that than I could ever do. I'll link some of my favorite ones below. And yes, you're welcome. Besides, the genesis of the animated series of Star Trek has less to do with the beginning of Star Trek itself, and more to do with the end of it. On June 3rd, 1969, Star Trek ended its proposed 5-year mission after only 3 seasons, with the particularly sexist and also particularly bad episode Turnabout Intruder, in which Kirk trades bodies with a very bitter ex of his. Yeah, it's not a great one. It should have come as no surprise that the ratings, which were never really stellar, see what I did there, were well underwater by then, after the show was moved to Friday nights at 10 p.m. during its 3rd season. But then something surprising happened. the show got picked up for syndication, which is where most of us who grew up in the 1970s watched it for the first time, and it turned into a ratings juggernaut.
You can't harm me. Are you a fucking ass? Do you not know who I am? He must not know who I am. I'm the juggernaut, bitch. I'm gonna hit you with your own pimp.
Sorry, it's mandatory to play that clip when you use that word. Anyway, the ratings were high enough in syndication that it often beat out network offerings in the same time slot, and this led Gene Roddenberry to think that there might be some hope for continuing the show in some form. Roddenberry had already successfully tried to get the show onto the big screen as early as 1969, and both Paramount and the animated series' eventual producer Filmation had worked together to try to launch an animated series that same year. Filmation, of course, had been behind several series during the 1960s, including The New Adventures of Superman, and would later become renowned for such shows as He-Man and She-Ra in the 1980s. Filmation's Don Christensen proposed a series featuring the original crew training a crew of teenage cadets on the USS Excalibur. Each crew member would have his or her own trainee, with Spock training a Vulcan kid named Steve, because as we all know, Steve is a traditional Vulcan name, McCoy training a black kid named Bob, well, that's slightly better, and Sulu training a Chinese kid named Stick. Yeah, that's a lot worse. But because Roddenberry and Paramount had such an acrimonious relationship by that point, Filmation head Lou Scheimer was unable to get the two talking, and along with concerns from NBC about the project, it ended up being shelved. And it's just as well. I mean, a Star Trek show aimed at kids featuring an established Star Trek character training a ship of cadets would never...
I'm Catherine Janeway, your training advisor. I'm a hologram based on one of the most decorated captains in Starfleet history, programmed to assist the Protostar's crew on their journey back to Federation space.
Oh, yeah. Once the original series became a runaway success in syndication, Hanna-Barbera expressed interest in producing a series that also would have been more kid-oriented. But Scheimer approached Roddenberry with his own proposal, which was much closer to the original series and would be aimed at both kids and their parents, and this was much more to Roddenberry's liking. By 1972, all the parties involved had reached a deal. Roddenberry would be given full creative control, which would be both a blessing and a curse, as usual. The show would be produced using elements from the original series, including a rotoscoped Enterprise from the opening sequence. It would also feature most of the original actors, making it one of the most expensive animated shows to be produced. It almost did not include Nichelle Nichols as Uhura and George Takei as Sulu. Both those characters would have been voiced respectively by Majel Barrett, who played Nurse Chapel, and James Doohan, who played Mr. Scott. But Leonard Nimoy in particular refused to take part in the project unless Nichols and Takei were also cast. The odd man out was Walter Koenig, who could not be cast as Chekhov because the budget was already so high. He was instead given the opportunity to contribute a script to the series called The Infinite Vulcan, and trust me, we'll be talking about that one. Because of the high budget, very few guest actors were used on the show. The few remaining guest actors from the original series were Mark Leonard as Sarek, Stanley Adams as Cyrano Jones, and Roger C. Carmel as Harry Mudd. Ed Bishop and Ted Knight also contributed to the show. Otherwise, almost all, and I mean all, of the other voices were handled either by James Doohan or by Majel Barrett, with Nichols and Takei also occasionally doing other roles. The show also hired several writers who had contributed to the original series. D.C. Fontana, who had served as story editor for the first season of the original series, came back to fill the same role for this series. She brought back writers such as David Gerrold and Samuel A. Peebles, and even got sci-fi writer Larry Niven to adapt one of his own short stories into an episode, despite the extremely low pay that they offered to writers. Former writer-producer Gene Kuhn turned down the offer to write a script for the show for just that reason. Also, the show would not feature the original theme by Alexander Courage. Courage had had disputes with Gene Roddenberry ever since Roddenberry took it upon himself to write lyrics for the theme for the original show, just so he himself could get some of the royalties from its continued use on the show. As a result, Ray Ellis, under the pseudonym Yvette Blaze, which was his wife's maiden name, composed a new theme and new musical cues for the show, with producer Norm Prescott taking his usual cut of the royalties for all Filmation music under the pseudonym Jeff Michael. I guess this was a common practice back then. On September 8, 1973, the show premiered its first episode, Beyond the Farthest Star, written by Samuel A. Peoples. He also happened to have written the second pilot for the original show, Where No Man Has Gone Before. It's worth looking at this episode in detail to see all of the strengths that this show has going for it. In Beyond the Farthest Star, the Enterprise is pulled into the orbit of a dead star just beyond the outermost rim of the galaxy. There, they find a derelict ship from an advanced alien race. Turns out there's an evil entity lurking on that ship, wanting to take over the Enterprise, and if they escape, they may be taking this evil entity with them. And if that sounds like the sort of plot you'd get in the original series, that's because it is. Right away, it's clear that this show is meant to follow on from its predecessor.
Captain's log, stardate 5221.3. On outward course beyond the fringe of our galaxy towards Questar M17.
In fact, D.C. Fontana herself considered the animated series' first season to be year 4 of the 5-year mission. There are at least 4 direct sequels to episodes from the original series, including Yesteryear, which is a sequel to Journey to Babel, More Tribbles, More Troubles, which is a sequel to The Trouble Tribbles, Once Upon a Planet, which is a sequel to Shore Leave, and Mud's Passion, which is a sequel to both of the 2 episodes featuring Harry Mudd. Not to mention the reappearance of characters featured in both those episodes and others. The shows are also very tightly plotted and go by very quickly, mostly due to that strict 23-minute running time which is the standard for cartoon series of this era. As a result, none of them try too hard to explain who those characters from past episodes are, and they probably wouldn't need to, since the original would have been airing in syndication at the same time anyway. Most of the series, with some notable exceptions, operates at this higher level of story quality. It's not a show that talks down to its viewers, especially not with dialogue like this.
The hexagonal shape of the windows suggests a similarity to natural insect designs of Earth, the honeycombs of bees. The individual cells are shaped precisely like this.
Mind you, that's not quite up to Star Trek The Next Generation's level of technobabble, but it's also not the sort of thing the typical Saturday morning cartoon viewer would see in 1973. And just like the original series, the animated series was novelized, in this case by Alan Dean Foster. If you were to shift between reading James Blish's novels for the original series and Foster's novels for the animated series, you'd really be unable to discern a major difference in the storytelling at all. If you're an adult or teenager who wants to watch this, you're going to be pleasantly surprised. If you're an actual kid, well, we'll get there. Another strength of the animated series is the acting, which honestly doesn't get enough credit, in my opinion. Some critics say that William Shatner in particular is just phoning in his performance, but if anything, the animated format forces him to have to rein in his, shall we say, louder impulses. Mind you, he does have his moments in the animated series, which we'll get to, but overall, having a more restrained Shatner on board is a plus for this series. The rest of the cast take to voice acting like ducks to water. Leonard Nimoy and DeForest Kelley are pitch perfect as Spock and McCoy, even in the episodes where the cast of actors were not all acting in the same room, which, as it turns out, was all but 3 episodes, the first one included. Nichelle Nichols and George Takei, though they appear less in the series than they did originally, also get right back into their roles with ease. But the lion's share of praise has to go to both James Doohan and Majel Barrett, who, in addition to voicing Scotty and Chapel, also voiced just about every other secondary character in most of the 22 episodes. This includes James Doohan doing the Edosian navigator Lieutenant Erix, and Barrett voicing the Cation communications officer Lieutenant Maress. Spoiler alert though, this is one of those strengths that also doubles as a weakness, so yeah. The presence of Erix and Maress gives us another strength of this show. It's finally able to do some genuinely alien characters. Sure, the original gave us the Horta, the Companion, and whatever this is. But doing the show in animation allows the writers to come up with some amazing ideas, with occasional misfires.
Most unpleasant situation, Captain.
We now have non-humanoid aliens among the bridge crew, aliens working with Starfleet and the Federation, and even some alien races that we've never seen before realized extraordinarily well. Additionally, this series has some of the best backgrounds for an animated series. Rather than go with some simplified version of the Enterprise interiors, the bridge and other parts of the ship are reproduced with astonishing care. It's even better when the crew gets to go to a truly alien ship, as they do in this first episode, or visit a planet with its own distinct flora and fauna. These visuals rival just about anything the original series did, even with some of its more impressive matte paintings, and some of these vistas are just astonishing. I mean, really, look at this. That is just gorgeous. That being said, there are just as many weaknesses as strengths to this show, some of them mirror images of each other. Well, no, not that much of a mirror image. Then again, not far from it either.
Some said it couldn't be done.
The odds against something like this happening are astronomical.
Some just didn't care.
I'll check it out after lunch.
But now,
behold, gentlemen, the dawning of a new era.
Star Trek, every weekday on Nickelodeon.
Excellent.
Bizarre planets 5 days a week. Weird aliens 5 days a week. Dr. McCoy freaking out 5 days a week.
An extraordinary phenomenon.
Join the adventure on Star Trek, now every weekday at 3/2 Central on Nickelodeon.
As much freedom as the animation gives the writers to imagine aliens and alien worlds, it also results in a very obvious flaw, especially if you watch these episodes back to back to back, as I did. While it's true that all animated series will reuse certain sequences to save on money, Filmation was particularly bad about this, and it's a lot easier to spot with the Star Trek series. Spock at his viewer is a common one, as is Scotty at the transporter, Uhura at her station, and so on. But it goes beyond that. There are also times when the quality control is not quite what it should be, especially when easy-to-catch errors are left in the finished product. For example, in the first episode, we have the mystery of the disappearing and reappearing Mr. Erix. Now you see him, and now you don't. Oh, but look, there he is again. And what exactly is happening to Chapel's arm in this shot? As I mentioned, Filmation had a reputation for this sort of thing that carried over well into the 1980s, as any viewer of He-Man can tell you the same sort of thing happens there. They also tended towards long static shots of the sort that I was just gushing about before the commercial break. The reasoning for this is obvious. If you have a long tracking shot, you're not having to animate anything over it. And while this is good for lengthy panoramas like the one from that first episode, it's sometimes all too obvious that it's just there to pad out the time. And yes, that sequence goes on for a long while. Mind you, it's probably better to have the reused static poses of the main characters than to have the animators try to give these characters actual emotions, because sometimes that ends up being far less successful. Repetition is also a problem for the musical score. The first time you hear those musical action cues, they're pretty damn impressive. Unfortunately, even more so than in the original series, which didn't actually reuse music cues as much as people seem to think, the animated series will bring up the same ones again, and again,
The Clotho's dead ahead.
and again. Of course, it's a cost-saving measure, and kids in 1973 and 1974 were unlikely to be able to watch these episodes back-to-back like we can, but I'm sure they noticed it. They probably also noticed how often they were hearing the same voices. To their credit, James Doohan and Majel Barrett always try to do something different when voicing another character, especially when they're doing Erex and Maress. But each of them has such a distinct voice to begin with that it's hard to ignore that it's one of them doing the voices at times.
I shall require a medical report on the prisoner, Miss Chapel.
Of course, Mr. Spock. I think you deserve congratulations for trapping him so cleverly.
My young cousin has a more difficult road to travel than others.
You seem to understand him better than my husband. Oh, such wondrous ones. They honor us. I am Fille, the head female. Welcome, James Kirk.
And that also goes for Nichelle Nichols and George Takei, the few times they do other voices as well.
So, the people of Earth would spread their evil to our home?
You'll now stand before the ruling council.
And sadly, not all of their voice characterizations are equally successful. Yesteryear, for instance, brings back the Guardian of Forever from the original series, where it sounded like this.
Since before your sun burned hot in space, and before your race was born, I have awaited a question.
What are you?
I am the Guardian of Forever.
Who are you? Really?
Really?
I am the Guardian of Forever.
And here's how it sounds in Yesteryear.
Is it possible for Spock to return to Vulcan and repair the timeline that has been broken so all is the same as before?
It is possible if no other major factor is changed.
Hoo boy. Sounds like the Guardian of Forever has had a few rough millennia, doesn't it? Probably the only other thing that can be called a weakness with the animated series is that it can at times be too fantastical, which may be why some fans refuse to see it as canon, despite its having the very first appearance of what would later be called the holodeck.
A swim at the beach?
It is lovely, but I'm more in the mood for a nice, quiet walk in the woods.
Doctor, that sounds perfect.
Then woods it is. We've got a whiteout condition here. How will we ever find the exit?
There are episodes of this show that die-hard fans would be hard-pressed to say don't belong in the franchise canon, and there are surprisingly many of them. Winnowing down my choices from must-watch episodes to just 3 was particularly difficult, so you should expect me to mention a few more. But if you want a sense of whether you should watch this show, take a look at these. I know, I was just knocking James Doohan's voice for the Guardian of Forever and Majel Barrett's voice for Amanda, but there's very little else to knock about this episode. In fact, this is one of the few episodes that Gene Roddenberry established as canon simply because it was a fan favorite, because as we all know, if something's good, that's the only thing that makes it canon.
Excuse me, I'd just like to ask a question. What does God need with a starship?
As they did in the original series episode City on the Edge of Forever, the crew makes a visit to the Guardian of Forever, and their visit causes a change in the time stream that results in Spock being erased from the time stream and his place being taken by a new Andorian first officer. Spock realizes that something changed in his own past, and he must now travel back to his own childhood, posing as an older cousin and meeting his father Sarek in the process. In addition to finally showing us what a Sailot looks like.
Well, he did have a pet Sailot he was very fond of.
Solid?
No, Bones, a Sailot. Didn't you just hear her say it? In addition to that, we also see something of what Spock's childhood as a half-Vulcan, half-human was like, complete with bullying Vulcan children, the likes of which we'll never see again in the entire franchise.
You're a Tyran, Spock. You could never be a true Vulcan.
That is not true. Your father brought shame to Vulcan. He married a human. You haven't even mastered a simple Vulcan neck pinch yet, Earther.
Spock.
I presume you've prepared new insults for today? This is your 35th attempt to elicit an emotional response from me.
You're neither human nor Vulcan and therefore have no place in this universe.
Look, it's human eyes. They look sad, don't they?
Perhaps an emotional response requires physical stimuli. He's a traitor, you know. Your father, for marrying her, that human whore.
Tell me again why this show isn't considered canon? And that's honestly all I can tell you about this episode, because you really should watch it. It does something really unusual for a cartoon series of that time, and for that alone, it's well worth watching. Trust me, you'll know it when you see it. In The Time Trap, the Enterprise investigates an area of space called the Doubt's Triangle, where vessels have been disappearing for ages. After an attack by the Klingons, both the Enterprise and the Klingons are trapped in a timeless dimension that they can never escape from. This one brings back the Klingon Commander Kor from the episode Errand of Mercy, who would later appear in Star Trek DS9.
The Clothos, dead ahead.
That will not be needed here, Commander Kor.
I commanded the 1st Division from the Clothos.
Alright, tell me again how this show isn't canonical? Unfortunately, it doesn't bring back John Colicos as Kor, but it does give us an excellent, tense episode, showing the Enterprise crew and the Klingons having to work together for a change. It doesn't go quite as planned, of course, but as Klingon episodes go, it's extremely good, and the character designs for the creatures inside the Timeless Zone are awesome. This is the very first Alan Dean Foster adaptation that I ever read, long before seeing the episode, and the episode itself didn't disappoint. Remember how I mentioned that DC Fontana got Larry Niven to adapt one of his short stories? This is the one, in which Spock, Uhura, and Sulu must bring a rare artifact from the ancient slavers to Starfleet, only to be waylaid by the Kzinti, who want it for themselves. Although this one doesn't feel as much like a Star Trek episode, if you were to replace the word slavers with preservers in your head, it's not too far from certain of the original series episodes. This one is also notable for being the only episode of original Trek not to feature Kirk, and as such, it gives the characters of Spock, Uhura, and Sulu a chance to shine, not to mention giving Nichelle Nichols and George Takei some well-deserved attention. And even though the Kzinti are very much a Larry Niven creation, they're a worthy addition to the Star Trek universe. They were almost featured in Next Generation and Enterprise a few times due to the efforts of freelance writer Jimmy Diggs. And they do show up in other Star Trek media. They even get referred to by name in Star Trek Picard.
Shields up! Perimeter scans to max! We've had a little trouble around here lately with the Kzinti.
So tell me again why this show isn't considered... Oh, yeah, you get the point by now. In any case, this episode is astonishingly good and should definitely be watched. As far as honorable mentions go, I have to at least talk about the Lorelei signal. The plot is so predictable that as soon as I tell you the title and the fact there is a planet of beautiful women in it, you can likely guess what happens. But this one is worth noting because it is the first time that Lieutenant Uhura gets to command the ship.
Aye, aye, Lieutenant.
What are you doing?
Taking command of this ship.
Even if she doesn't end up sitting in the center chair. This episode also makes it abundantly clear that there are plenty of women aboard the Enterprise in command posts, many of them in security, and all of them the equal of their male counterparts.
The year we were together at Starfleet is the only time in my life I was alive.
I never stopped you from going on with your space work.
Your world of starship captains doesn't admit women.
And yet that moment is considered canon, somehow, despite what later shows have revealed about there always having been women captains in Starfleet. Who do you have to sue to get a show canonized anyway?
He was an idiot.
You may also have noticed that I didn't mention any of the other sequels to previous episodes, such as the Tribbles one, or the Harry Mudd one, or the Shore Leave one. And to be frank, they're not bad episodes, but they're not instant classics either. Even if it is fun to watch Kirk get buried in Tribbles one more time. There are episodes that are worse, but strangely, I had to work to figure out which 3 to choose, because even the bad ones have elements that may interest you. In any case, all of these will have spoilers, so look out. In Jihad, Kirk and Spock must work with a team of allies to find and recover a religious artifact called the Soul of the Score before a galactic holy war breaks out. Now, I'm not entirely sure what this episode is trying to be, but it's not quite Star Trek. If this show were to be made canon, then this episode would have to go in there too, and there's nothing about it that's particularly Trekky, shall we say. If anything, it plays out more like a D&D campaign that someone's thrown 2 Star Trek characters into, or maybe an intergalactic version of Ocean's 11. In addition to Kirk and Spock, we get Char, the Prince of the Score, Sword, who provides the muscle, Lara, a huntress with a unique tracking sense, and who is the only woman Kirk gets to flirt with in the entire animated series, and unsuccessfully at that.
My world, there's a lot of females, not so many men. Come we find a man attractive, we say so. I'm saying so. How do you find me?
Fascinating. But we're not here on a pleasure trip, Lara.
All the more reason to take what pleasure there might be in it.
This is a kid's show, after all. And finally, the oddly named M3 Green, a master lockpick voiced by, of all people, writer David Gerrold, who created the Tribbles.
My people are cautious, what you would call cowards.
I told you their budget was tight. While the aliens in this one are really alien, so is the plot, and it just doesn't feel like Star Trek. Another episode this season, the ambergris element, takes similar risks, but feels more like it could fit into the Star Trek universe. This one just doesn't. It's still watchable, though, even if you can see the resolution of the episode coming from parsecs away. After being caught and damaged in an energy vortex, the Enterprise encounters an alien called Lucien, who uses what appears to be magic to repair their ship and take them back to his homeworld of Megas 2. When the crew starts being able to use magic on their own, against Lucien's wishes, they draw the attention of the other inhabitants of Megas 2, who once lived on Earth ages ago and who want to put Lucien on trial. It turns out that all of the witches burned in Salem really were witches, and Lucien himself is, wait for it, the devil. Yeah. Unlike the previous episode, this one is almost too much like an original Star Trek episode. The basic idea had already been done in Plato's Stepchildren, but this is a bit harder to swallow. It probably doesn't help that Gene Roddenberry was said to have extensively rewritten this from Larry Brody's original script, which NBC objected to because Lucien was originally going to be, well, God. And you just can't have the Star Trek crew meeting God, can you?
Excuse me.
It will carry my power to every corner of creation.
Canon, why isn't it, etc., etc., etc. This one can very easily be avoided, and probably should be, for the exact same reasons that the next one should be. After tracking down a mysterious signal, the Enterprise is trapped by a ship that looks like, well, this. It turns out to belong to an alien calling itself Kukla?
Kukulkan.
Yeah, that's it. Anyway, he's got the same name as the ancient god of the Mayans and Aztecs, and sure enough, he is the ancient god of the Mayans and Aztecs, and he looks like this. You know, there are times when animation probably should have limits, aren't there? Anyway, Kuglafran and Ollie want the crew of the Enterprise to solve the riddle of his city, which has features from the Egyptian, Aztec, and Chinese cultures because, as it turns out, he has taught all of these cultures, and none of them has completed his designs successfully. Then he wants them to worship him because isn't that what all of these all-powerful aliens who are gods to ancient humans want? Criminally, this is the first time we ever get a Native American crewman, and we won't get one again in canonical Star Trek media until Chakotay in Star Trek Voyager. Speaking of which, Larry Brody, who wrote that last episode I talked about, also wrote Tattoo for Voyager, which draws a similar and equally ridiculous tie between Native Americans and aliens. And please, don't get me started on the Paradise Syndrome. Seriously, what is it with this show and how it handles Native Americans? Apart from the obviously unfortunate implication that these ancient alien cultures, all of them non-white, couldn't possibly have built anything like they did without the help of aliens, which, if you think about it, is just a lovely notion for a show like Star Trek to get behind, even obliquely. This episode boasts impressive enough animation, but it just isn't very good otherwise. And yet, it was this episode, and this episode alone, that was submitted to the Emmy committee, so you could easily argue that the Emmy win for this show is because of this. That being said, this episode won an Emmy as well, and the less said about it, the better. And yes, there are other episodes in the 2-season and 26-episode run of this series that are less impressive than they should be, though most of them are grouped in the abbreviated 6-episode second season. Walter Koenig's script, The Infinite Vulcan, is from the first season, but it got so rewritten by Gene Roddenberry, it might as well be his, so he can take the blame for that one. Don't blame Chekhov. Unfortunately, the very last episode of the show, the Counterclock Incident, may provide the biggest argument against the show's canonicity, as it features the never-before-seen first captain of the Enterprise, Robert April, and his wife, Sarah. Well, except there's this now.
Computer, list Starfleet's most decorated captains, living and deceased.
Working.
Robert and Sarah must take over the ship after it ends up in a negative universe where time flows backward. This causes the entire crew of the ship to get younger, and it results in this.
How was our course, Mr. Sulu? I don't know. What am I doing here? What is all this equipment?
And yeah, the episode's no worse than the next-gen episode Rascals that also de-aged several of the crew, but that one wasn't all that great either.
I need to see him now! Now!
Despite all of this, this show has had an enduring influence on the rest of the franchise, and whether it's actually considered canon or not, we still have Kor referring to his ship from the animated series when he visits DS9. Vulcan's Forge from yesteryear is seen in all its glory in a multi-episode arc of Enterprise, and there have been numerous references in Star Trek Discovery, The Lower Decks, and in Picard. And probably, by the time I put this video out, there will have been at least one or two mentions in Strange New Worlds. But at the end of the day, how does this series actually rate? I'd give it 3.5 out of 5 tribbles. And by the way, that's close to the score I would give the original series, because to my mind, this show is a continuation of the original series. The animated series is still extremely popular with fans, to the point that it's been continued with fan films on YouTube. Whether these are successful or not depends on your tolerance for celebrity impersonations. I'll put a link in the description below so you can check them out yourself. There's even recently been a Star Trek The Next Generation animated short film done in the style of the original series and using the soundtrack from The Best of Both Worlds. I'll put the link to that in the description below as well. The recent Star Trek Year 5 comic series includes Eric's, Maress, and other elements alongside those from the original series, and they fit just fine. And why shouldn't they? They've got all the original crew back, acting just as they did before, minus Chekhov, of course. We've got decent animation and scoring, albeit a bit repetitive at times. And we've got scripts that rival those of the original series in intelligence and action, appealing to fans of all ages. Or rather, almost all ages. Star Trek the Animated Series ended exactly because it was not aimed at younger kids, who were the exact target demographic for a Saturday morning cartoon. To his credit, even Lou Scheimer himself admitted that he never considered it a kids' show, and he even lobbied, unsuccessfully, to have the show move to prime time. If he had been successful, if he had gotten people to see this show as a worthy continuation of Star Trek, then maybe we wouldn't have had to wait another 50 years to get another decent animated series based in this franchise, let alone 2. And that's it for this edition of That 70s Review. In the meantime, if you want to see more of this sort of thing, give this video a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, do that thing with the bell that you do so well, and tell me in the comments what shows from the 1970s that you would like me to cover. Till next time, stay safe and stay groovy.